The Illuminate Arts and Faith Conference in Chattanooga, Tennessee wants to help you find your tribe. Do you get way too excited about quoting Wendell Berry or C.S. Lewis in conversations with coworkers? Does your Spotify playlist include hymns, a little jazz, and a whole lot of Andrew Peterson? Join your tribe at Illuminate March 31 and April 1 for education and inspiration from speakers Russ Ramsey, Douglas McKelvey, John Hendricks, and others. Find a complete list of session topics and ticket information at southern.edu/illuminate.
In 2024, I set out to meet as many poets as I could and spend an hour with each one. I got more than I bargained for, more insight, more clarity, more hope. It's proved to be one of the richest highlights of my life. 17 writers, 17 deeply human conversations that made me sit up and pay attention. Franz Kafka once said, if the book we're reading doesn't wake us up with a blow to the head, what are we reading for? A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. And that's what I hope this new book will do. I hope it wakes us up, my friends. I hope these conversations will be the catalyst for something to be reawakened, re-enchanted, and reinvigorated. It's called An Axe for the Frozen Sea, Conversations with Poets about what matters most. I'm Ben Palpin, and I hope you'll come and listen in as I spend a little time with poets like Lucy Shaw, Malcolm Guite, Dana Gioia, and Lee Young Lee. Pull up a chair at the table as we dig into what it means to write well and to live well. An Axe for the Frozen Sea is now available from Rabbit Room Press. Visit the store at rabbitroom.com, or better yet, ask about it at your favorite bookseller.
Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. James K.A. Smith is a professor of philosophy at Calvin College in Michigan and the author of many books, including Desiring the Kingdom, You Are What You Love, and most recently, On the Road with St. Augustine. His work on St. Augustine has been exceedingly helpful to me, both as a writer and as a human being, as you will hear in this conversation. Jamie Smith, thank you so much for being on the Habit Podcast. I really appreciate you making time for us.
Oh, it's great to talk to you.
You know, Augustine has been such an important part of my sort of inner world for years, and really your work on St. Augustine has been very important for me, really given me a way in to make sense. So thank you for the work you've done in Imagining the Kingdom and, or I guess to say Desiring the Kingdom, that whole series, and You Are What You Love, and now On the Road with St. Augustine, which I have been reading. I love it. I think it's going to be a really important book.
Oh, thanks so much. Yeah, I feel like I've been sort of writing this book for 20 years because Augustine's been with me the whole way. So, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, just his idea of, the ordered and disordered and reordered loves, I just think it's so helpful for thinking about all of human experience and it certainly has been a big part of the way I think about writing and the way I teach writing.
Fascinating.
Because every creative writing teacher who's ever lived, I think, has said, what do your characters want? You understand your character. I mean, or you might say your character is his wants, which, by the way, that's what my character is too, as a person. It's what I want. And I make choices based on what I want. And then, there are consequences, and then maybe my desires change. I think it's just so helpful in so many ways, for writers to think about these things.
I love this connection you're making, because it also explains then why writing is such a science of the soul, as it were. I mean, it's the art that is the science of the soul, and why a novel can tell me more about myself and can tell us more about humanity than a newspaper article, because in a way the best literature is getting at people's hungers, desires, and is getting at is trying to honor the complexity of that. Mm-hmm. And I think Augustine it's interesting. In fact, I'm talking to a friend who teaches at the University of Iowa Writers Workshop, Garth Greenwell. And when he teaches writing, he teaches Augustine's Confessions, and not just for memoir, but for a kind of writing that is attentive to the dynamics of desire, the way in which our loves are sort of the engine that drive our being in the world. And I think you're right that Augustine is, in that sense, I think one of the reasons why Augustine is still with us is because he was so prescient in that regard. And so it's at once very, very intimate. You know, you can peer into a soul, and yet it also helps you to understand others. So it's, I'm encouraged to hear that that's helpful in teaching writing too. That's very cool.
Yeah. Maybe we should back up. I mean, I'm kind of launched in as if everybody listening knows what we're talking about as far as ordered and disordered loves. And
sure.
Could you sort of give us a quick summary?
Yeah. So I think probably the aspect of Augustine that most captivated me, and I'm trained as a philosopher, so that slightly skews maybe the way I came to Augustine, but what struck me was first and foremost that he looks at who we are as human beings, and he sees the seat and center of the human person is located in the heart, by which he doesn't mean just this mushy emotionalism. He just means that's the engine room of our loves. And so what really defines me and what motivates me and moves me and what kind of governs my being is what I love. Mm-hmm. But so everybody, to be human is to love. You can't not love. Augustine, that first paragraph in the Confessions where he says, "You have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you." So every creature, by virtue of being made in God's image, is longing for something, is looking for something, is chasing after something. And that's really on the register of love. But then Augustine says, that doesn't mean that we all love the same things, nor does it mean that we love what we ought, right? There's a kind of design claim here that humanity is made to love, and it's ultimately made to love the one who made them, to love God who welcomes them. The effect of sin and brokenness and tragedy in our lives is not that we stop loving something, it's that our love gets disordered, it gets misdirected, it's aimed, the aim is crooked and bent, and now we're chasing created things instead of the creator, hoping those created things could satisfy an infinite hunger. So now we're looking for love in all the wrong places. We're chasing after facets of the creation, glomming onto them, grasping them as if they could be everything to us. And when we do that, they sort of slip through our fingers, they become nothing, and we're still hungry. So that's we can't not love, but our loves can be disordered.
Yeah. And
really redemption is finding the right target for our loves, remembering who we were made for.
Yeah. And it seems like every story you read is that story, right? It's people getting into one kind of trouble or another because of some disordered love, and usually it's their own, sometimes it's somebody else's that causes heartache for them. And then in the end, that resolution is some sort of correction of their lives.
And it's a correction it's a correction or it's a restoration, it's a healing on the order of their loves. And it's not just, what they believe about the world or what they think about the world, right? It's cooking along under the radar of all those kinds of things in some ways.
Wait, could you say that again? You said it's not that they, what did you just say that they don't do?
So it's not, what happens is, I think the dynamic is it's not always a matter of how I'm thinking about the world or what I believe about the world that's really the source of my problem. I might say, you could have a character and it looks like, oh, well, their problem is they believe the wrong thing or they have the wrong ideas. But in fact, usually that's just a symptom and a manifestation that they want the wrong things. And and so a resolution for a character is not always like figuring something out. It's actually sort of finding what they were made for, and finding the end of their loves in that regard. I mean, interestingly, I think that's exactly the trajectory of Augustine's own story in the Confessions, is that in a way it looks for a long time like his problem is this intellectual puzzle he has to solve about how should I think about God and what's the truth. But what's interesting is by the time you get to book 7 of the Confessions, in a way he has resolved all those intellectual problems. He actually sort of knows what the truth is, but he would still admit he's not who he's supposed to be. He still is characterized by anxiety and fragmentation. And it's not until he actually gives himself over on the order of his loves that he really finds kind of wholeness and resolution for himself. And I think that's important.
Yeah, and even that prayer, Lord, make me chaste, but not yet, is I know in my head what I need to be, but my heart's not there yet.
Yeah, exactly. And he knew, I think, and this is the difference between different kinds of stories, too. I think the heart of what would be an Augustinian story is the heart I need is itself always going to be a gift. It's going to be like what Tolkien called, the eucatastrophe. It's going to be something that's given to me. And if there's an act I need to undertake, it's an act of surrender. It's an act of opening myself up, of receiving, which of course is a deep offense to my pride, who wants to be able to say, I figured it out, I achieved it, I accomplished it.
Yeah. That's great. As you, these longings send us on journeys, right? I mean, the central metaphor of your latest book is it's on the road with St. Augustine. It's this moving through time and space in search of something, and not just through time and space. It's also a mental journey. And I'm sure you've heard the old saying: there are only two kinds of stories: a stranger comes to town, or a person takes a trip. And
I have not heard that. That's good. That's really good.
And I thought about that as I was reading through your book, On the Road with St. Augustine. That yes, that's where that saying comes from. Yeah, we're on journeys because we don't know, because there's space between where we are and what we want and
Yes. So there's a sense in which to say that human beings are lovers first and foremost, right? That we want, that we long. Almost built into that is a picture of there is an out there that I'm after, and that I'm so humans who are lovers are also chasers, and so it's almost by the very nature it propels you elsewhere, and so I think that's part of it. I also think, I think it's a really interesting question because there's something about the journey too which dislocates me, and maybe that's also what happens when the stranger comes to me. There's a kind of dislocation where now I have to confront something about myself. Like in the journey, maybe the comforts of home drop away, and now I have to see something in myself. Or I'm encountering others who are a mirror for me that I never had at home. And I think that explains why pilgrimage is so crucial to the spiritual life in a way.
Yeah, that disorientation, this is where story comes from.
Yeah, right.
And I think I've said this in this podcast before. Florida is such a rich source of story because people are always running into each other who don't normally run into each other. And also the natural, they find themselves in the swamp, and the swamp itself is a place where the water meets the land, and this kind of animal meets this kind of.
Yes.
I've got a Florida thing, but the
no, that's good. It's good. This is a Lauren Groff trajectory too.
That's right.
I haven't thought of it that way. For Augustine too, I think, and not just for Augustine, but I think Augustine gets this. I think he thinks this is part of the human condition, that we are in a way all looking for another country. We are all exiles. We are all strangers in the land. Now that's partly because we made ourselves strangers, but he thinks there's. I don't mean to trot out big theological words, but he thinks there's this eschatological aspect that everybody is looking for this kingdom to come, some version of that, and so because we are all oriented to some end like that, we're looking for another country like Abraham. Everybody's on this trek, and the situation of exile also names something about the human condition. And then the question is, can you be an exile who also knows where home is? And I think there's a lot of rich possibilities for narrative art in between those two things.
Yeah. Yeah, you used the term "out there" a little while ago, and I think that's one thing that's distinctive. We're used to the idea of pursuing our desires every Disney movie starts with the "I want" song, right? I want this, and then you spend the movie going. And an insight that I've run into throughout your work, and some of this is from Charles Williams, and some of it's from Augustine, but the idea that we don't get to invent what's going to make us happy. We don't get to invent. I mean, speaking of theological words, we don't get to invent our own telos. And so the idea of something out there, something that's not. I don't look inside to know what I need, who I am, but rather I look to something beyond me. I think that's a really important insight for a writer. Not just for characters in a story, but for a writer to realize my work is not just a map of my inner world, but rather I'm giving an account of what I've seen in the world, a world that I didn't make.
Yeah. I mean, I wonder if that helps explain, though, too, why maybe so many contemporary stories don't have this purchase on us, because I do think we live in a cultural moment where people do imagine they can make up their own telos, right? Sure. Like they imagine they can make up their own good. And then that makes for a terrible story because the world just sort of bends to your will and you try to it's just fantasy in the worst sense of the word, right? Like and it's not true. Whereas, for Augustine and for the kinds of stories, I think for the human condition, it's actually about how do I find the way I fit into a world I didn't make? How do I find a way to fit and make sense of myself into a world that's given? That's given in the sense that I run into it, but also given in the sense that it's gifted. It's created. It's given to me, and I think that actually just makes for much more interesting literature, much more interesting narrative. Though, and this is where, in some ways, it's almost hard to read Augustine from modernity, because, as you said, we've kind of inherited this assumption that the world is what's in our heads and what we make of it. Whereas, interestingly, for Augustine, even when Augustine turns inward and he starts trying to plumb the depths of his own consciousness, Augustine he uses this metaphor of a cave, and he says, when you turn me into myself and I start trying to plumb the depths of my own soul, it's like I reach this cavern whose bottom I can never sound. And there's almost a kind of infinity within me, and then you hear the echoes of God reverberating from the bottom of it. So even for Augustine, interiority is so different than modern interiority. It has an infinity about it because it's the soul that's made in God's image. And I do think so I'm a huge fan of 19th century French literature, and in many ways I still think they understood that. I think Flaubert understood, despite all his sort of proto-modernism, I think he understood that we are always more than we could make of ourselves, and trying to grapple with that mystery. I think mystery is a bit of a lost category for us in modernity.
What do you mean when you say that?
That there is a sense in which there's an elusiveness. We elude ourselves, which is precisely why you want to trust the one who made you to tell you your own story, right? I don't trust the story I would tell about myself because I don't have confidence that I know who I am.
Yeah.
And yet, if I surrender myself to the one who made me and knows me, in a sense, I'm receiving the gift of a story that helps me narrate my own identity. And that's perplexing. I mean, unfortunately, I think what happens in modernity at an age where we think we know everything is mystery just has a negative connotation.
Mm-hmm.
Like what we're saying is the mystery is something that has to be solved. It's, there's a puzzle and we're going to figure it out. Whereas this historic, even the St. Paul sense of mystery in the book of Ephesians, or what Augustine means by mystery, or the medievals, is mystery is this plenitude, this fullness, this overflowing, so that when you've waded into a mystery, it's not that you're puzzled, it's that you're sort of overwhelmed by possibility.
Yeah.
But it requires a lot of trust. Like, you have to know who you're trusting in that context. I'm not sure if that is very helpful for writers, but I do think it gets at something more true about the human condition than imagining that we could figure ourselves out.
Well, I think it's one reason it's helpful for writers is that it frees, it opens up some possibility. I mean, okay, if you've, I know there aren't many Christian bookstores left, but when you go through a Christian bookstore, you realize the extent to which evangelicalism has bought into that modernist demystification.
Yes.
We're going to, here's 7 steps to this and 5 easy ways to what, we're going to solve this problem, rather than wading into a mystery and saying, the universe is too much for me and God is too much for me, but here we go. We're going to try this.
Yes. Yeah. No, I agree. We often don't appreciate the depths to which modern Protestantism sort of drank the modernist Kool-Aid in that regard. It's one of the reasons why I actually think one of the best sort of imagination stretching exercises for Christian artists is to immerse themselves in ancient and medieval wisdom and traditions, because it's pre-modern, and so they've never fallen into the trap of imagining that we're thinking things.
Yeah. I've been reading a lot of, I say Aquinas, really Joseph Pieper.
Yeah.
I mean, getting my Aquinas through Joseph Pieper.
He's a good guide. He's a reliable guide.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
And this is just rocking my world. I mean, this business of, conforming yourself to, again, we've used this phrase already, to a reality that we didn't make. Man, I just think that is so helpful for a writer. And I think it's freeing for a writer to say, what was Edmund Spencer, says, "Fool, said my muse to me, look in thy heart and write." But, when I look in my heart and try to write, I don't know what to say. But when I look out at the world, I say, okay, I can do that.
Yeah.
I can give an account of what I've seen. And it's such a relief to get out of my head and instead write about, Florida or whatever,
Yeah. But it's interesting to then also imagine your reader and make room for her to dwell in mystery, right? So another temptation for us is to be sort of overly expositional and to make it all work for our reader and to solve it. Whereas, it's funny. I had this experience. I mean, I'm a philosopher. I'm an academic, so I'm still very much learning how to write. And in this book, the writing On the Road with St. Augustine was a new experience for me, because I knew I wanted to move into a kind of writing that was more narrative and literary. And one of the things I realized I had to learn is I had to actually say less, and I had to make room for the reader to have an encounter, but to then not program exactly how every reader was going to respond to that encounter. And there was a certain, almost a discipline of a kind of minimalism of not wanting to explain it all. And then once I'm not saying I accomplished it, but I think once I understood how that works, I then thought of novels, memoirs, biographies that I value, and realized, oh, yes, they gave me room as a reader to do some of my own imaginative work in that encounter. So in other words, they left room for mystery too. They didn't feel like they had to tie up all the loose ends.
Yeah. I want to return to something you said a minute ago that you kind of just breezed past, but I thought it was really important. And that is the idea of a story. Well, actually, I'm just going to. It reminded me of something from your new book that you were quoting Leslie Jamison when she was talking about the idea of addiction stories in recovery communities, the ways in which people find their identity in these stories, and the value of those stories was that they are unoriginal.
Yes.
And as writers, we so value originality because originality makes me seem smart. But can you talk about this idea that unoriginal stories are really valuable for people?
Yeah. So this is from Leslie Jamison's book, The Recovering, which is kind of a memoir of her own recovery, but then also a foray into the literature of recovery. And one of the things she struggled with as a writer and as a novelist, short story writer was, the burden is to always tell a story that no one's ever heard before. Otherwise, who's going to publish it? Mm-hmm. But then she would go to an AA meeting, and so much of an AA meeting was just people trading stories back and forth. But it was always kind of the same story, it was a very defined arc. And she had this sort of epiphany where she realized, wait, stories can do different things. These are stories that aren't supposed to be original. They are supposed to be stories we give one another so that I can actually sort of put it on and say, this fits me. Yeah. And now I know who I am, right? Like that's like somebody gives their testimony, as it were, tells their story in an AA meeting, and somebody who is there for the first time can say, that's me.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, that's me. And all of a sudden, now they have insight into who they are because they've received a story that helps them make sense of who they are. It's given them an identity.
Yeah.
And I think our culture has, we live with such a cult of novelty and uniqueness and quote unquote authenticity that everybody thinks they are the special, one of a kind. And I don't want to discount that there is a way in which that's true. But on the other hand, it is an absolute burden to imagine that you would have to invent your utterly unique story. Whereas maybe actually finding rest from anxiety is somebody giving you a story and saying, oh, that's me.
Yeah.
That's me. I mean, I just think of that as that's not being unoriginal. That's being found.
Yeah.
Which is a very different way to construe it.
Yes. I was talking back at around Valentine's Day. I did a little webinar on writing better love letters.
Nice. I should probably sign up for this.
Well, I'll give you this for free, Jamie. This is just for free.
Great.
This is just free. To write about your feelings, when you're feeling something, you think that's unique. You think my feelings are really unique. The truth is, your feelings are what's not unique. Everybody, the way you feel about your wife, there are lots of people who feel that about their wives. Mm-hmm. What is unique is the concrete, the things that happened, the things that you and your wife have shared and have done together. That's unique. And as you tell that story, that generates that same emotion that we all have felt for somebody. And I think something similar is going on in those AA stories. I mean, the details, I'm sure, change from story to story, but that underlying, not just the feelings, but the dynamics under those details. Yeah. So as you tell those details, it doesn't matter that those details are different for other people. You're evoking this common story.
Yeah, I think that's really insightful. David Foster Wallace also had a number of interesting reflections on cliche, which is, of course, something every writer wants to avoid, is being cliche. And we get exhausted by it. It's like, oh, really? On the other hand, he says, and this also comes from his own experience in recovery context, was, on the other hand, sometimes cliches work precisely because they're true. It's just that people have said them over and over and over again so many times. So I love what you're saying, that in a way, the unique intersection, though, is when this received story, even the cliche, intersects with your history. and your particular contingent legacy of life together or whatever it might be. And at that point, what's beautiful is, not that I'm saying something to my wife that no one else has ever said before, but that I'm taking the time and sometimes the courage and to say it now, here, despite everything, right? There's always a triumph of history in that.
That's great. I love the one sentence I love from your book. You said, "Identity is our name for being found by a story someone else told."
I'm glad you like that. Yeah, that's a very
insight.
Much a lesson I learned from Leslie Jameson too, and I think it's what Augustine was such. I mean, he was just one of these people that you almost would have loved to hate because he was just brilliant and popular, and all these kinds of things, and yet he spent a lifetime sort of not knowing who he was. I mean, that's his constant refrain is, I don't know who I am. I'm a mystery to myself. I'm an enigma to myself. And it's not until, he picks up Paul's epistle to the Romans and he reads this story again and he realizes, that's me. Mm-hmm. That's me. And then he sort of knows who he is. And it's a gift to receive such a story.
Yeah. And that's the gift that storytellers are giving to the world, or one of the gifts.
And it strikes me, by the way, too, because you'll know this more than others, but the trick isn't to tell a generic story, right? Mm-hmm. I think generic stories, vague stories, have no purchase on us whatsoever because we don't feel like we know anyone. So what Augustine does is he tells the very thick specificity of his own story.
Yes.
Hoping that somebody might read that and say, oh, well, this is about a very particular guy at a very particular time in a very particular place. And yet there is something universally human about it so that somebody could say, that's me.
Yeah.
And the recognition happens because of the specificity of the story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Flannery O'Connor said one country has to do for all countries. In your writing, you've got to delve into this one country. The only way you get to the universal is through the specific.
Yes, yeah. Which is a very incarnational idea too.
It is, isn't it? Yeah. Could you say one more sentence about that? When you say that's an incarnational idea?
Just in sense, we sometimes talk about the incarnation of God in Christ is sometimes described as a scandal of particularity, right? Like how could the creator of the cosmos sort of channel himself, become this first century Jew in Palestine, isn't that exclusive? And yet it's precisely because he came in the thick specificity of this person at this time, that then it actually creates the possibility of every human being finding themselves in his image, right? That the image of the invisible God could become the mirror in which we say, that's me. And it couldn't have been any other way. It couldn't have been some vague force that manifests itself. We would never recognize it. We need the mirror of specificity to be able to see ourselves.
Yeah. Wow. That's great. Okay, Jamie, I end every episode of The Habit by asking this question. I didn't give you any heads up, so sorry. But the question is, what writers make you want to write?
Yeah, which are interestingly are often the writers who also make you say, "Oh my gosh, I can't write a word."
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Flaubert, I will say Flaubert is a sort of touch point for me, and then I'm terrible at answering these questions because I always remember what I just read.
Sure, yeah.
But
Absolutely.
I'll say I mentioned him I think earlier, but Garth Greenwell is a writer at University of Iowa who I just finished his book, What Belongs to You, and he's got a new one coming out in January. And it's an experience of reading prose that is so luminous and yet invisible because it takes you right into the mind of another person. It was very inspiring to me. And then I should give you a poet because poetry is really important to me. And I would say Franz Wright, the poet Franz Wright, has been a touchstone who just makes sort of language and diction come alive for me in ways that others have not.
Huh.
I feel like I picked I tried to pick amongst my children and saying that.
Yeah, right. Sure. Yeah. Could you go back to Flaubert? What is it about Flaubert that makes you?
Flaubert is, I think, in many ways, I see a parallel between Flaubert and Augustine. Flaubert is such a remarkable psychologist. So I see him as somebody who has this incredible power of describing emotion, and how emotion then is the way we interpret and perceive the world. And but he also creates character and worlds that are so evocative. I guess what I love about Flaubert is he's sort of slow motion. You slow the world down, and over 15 pages, actually nothing has happened, but you've journeyed 1,000,000 miles in someone's consciousness, and I just find that quite delightful.
Yeah. Great. Well, Jamie, thank you so much. This has been a lot of fun.
This has been great fun. We could have talked forever. We should do it again sometime.
I think we could. Yeah, let's do.
Great.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan.
The Rabbit Room has partnered with Lipscomb University to make this podcast possible. Lipscomb has graciously given us access to their recording studio and the Center for Entertainment and Arts building. We're so grateful for their sponsorship, their encouragement, and the good work they do in Nashville. Special shout out as well to the Arcadian Wild for allowing us to use their delightful song Finch in the Pantry as part of this podcast. Check out their album of the same name for more excellent music.
The Habit membership is a library of resources for writers by me, Jonathan Rogers. More importantly, The Habit is a hub of community where like-minded writers gather to discuss their work and give each other a little more courage. Find out more at thehabit.co.
This podcast was produced by The Rabbit Room, a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to fostering Christ-centered community and spiritual formation through music, story, and art. All our podcasts are made possible by the generous support of our members. To learn more about us, visit rabbitroom.com, and to become a member, rabbitroom.com/donate.
If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, consider joining the Rabbit Room membership. Your membership helps sustain this community, funding everything from publishing and podcasts and theater productions to events and programs that support artists who create with a Christ-centered vision. We'd love to have you on board. Learn more at rabbitroom.com/member.